The night air had a slight chill to it as Officer James Wilson rolled down his patrol car window. The smell of fresh rain on asphalt filled his lungs. This was his favorite time to work, just after midnight when the streets were mostly empty and peaceful. 15 years on the force had taught him to appreciate these quiet moments. Officer Wilson took a sip from his coffee thermos. It had gone cold hours ago, but the caffeine still did its job. His radio crackled occasionally with routine check-ins from other officers patrolling different parts of the city. Nothing exciting tonight, and that was just fine with him. At 43 years old, he'd seen enough excitement to last a lifetime. The suburban streets of Atlanta looked different at night. During the day, they'd bustled with school buses, people rushing to work, and kids playing in yards. Now, the streetlights cast long shadows across empty driveways and darkened homes. Wilson drove slowly past a neighborhood park, his headlights briefly illuminating the empty swing sets before moving on. His mind wandered to his family at home. His wife would be sound asleep by now, and his teenage daughter had probably fallen asleep with her phone in her hand again. He smiled at the thought. These overnight shifts were tough on family life, but they'd found their rhythm over the years. Wilson's attention snapped back to the road as a black sedan passed in the opposite direction. His trained eye caught the speedometer on his dash. The car was going 42 in a 30 zone. Not dangerously fast, but definitely over the limit. Habit took over as he flipped a U-turn, switched on his lights, and followed the vehicle. The sedan continued for about 100 yards before pulling over smoothly to the side of the road. Wilson called in the stop to dispatch, reading off the license plate number and his location. Just a routine traffic stop, he added before hanging up the radio. As he prepared to exit his patrol car, Wilson went through his mental checklist. A ritual born from years of experience and training. Check mirrors for approaching traffic. Adjust body camera. Hand resting near holster, but not on it. Be alert, but not aggressive. The department had recently gone through new training sessions about bias and community relations. The chief had been clear. They needed to rebuild trust, especially with communities of color. Wilson had sat through those training sessions with mixed feelings. He didn't consider himself biased. He treated everyone the same, or at least he tried to. But he couldn't deny the tension that existed between police and certain communities. Walking up to the car, Wilson shined his flashlight briefly inside. A single driver, well-dressed black man, both hands visible on the steering wheel. Good, Wilson thought. The driver was doing everything right, making this stop easier for both of them. Wilson noticed something else too. The driver didn't have that nervous energy most people get when they're pulled over. Instead, there was a calm steadiness to him, almost like he'd been in this situation many times before. Not the calm of someone with nothing to hide, but the calm of someone who knew exactly what to do. It struck Wilson as unusual. The interior of the car was neat and organized. A suit jacket hung in the back, some papers on the passenger seat, a small gym bag on the floor. Everything about this scene was ordinary, yet something made Wilson pay extra attention. His instincts, honed over thousands of traffic stops, told him this one might be different. As he approached the driver's window, Wilson adjusted his tone to be professional but not intimidating. This was routine. Just another traffic stop on another quiet night. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, everything about this ordinary encounter would change, leaving both men seeing the world a little differently. The driver of the black sedan let out a long, tired breath when he saw the police lights flashing in his rearview mirror. David Taylor had been driving home after a 16-hour workday, his mind already dreaming of the shower and bed waiting for him. He hadn't even realized he was speeding. Not tonight, he whispered to himself as he signaled and pulled over to the curb. His body tensed automatically, a reaction built from years of similar experiences. As a black man in his 40s, David had been pulled over more times than he could count, often for reasons that seemed to disappear once the officer approached his window. David turned off the radio that had been playing soft jazz. The car fell silent except for the ticking of the turn signal he'd forgotten to switch off. He clicked it off and then placed both hands back on the steering wheel, making sure they were clearly visible. These movements weren't something he had to think about anymore. They were as automatic as putting on a seatbelt. His mind raced through possible scenarios. Was he really speeding? Would the officer be reasonable? Would this be a quick stop or turn into something more complicated? Even after all these years, the uncertainty never got easier. David glanced at his watch, 1:30 a.m. He'd stayed late at work to finish processing important documents that couldn't wait until morning. His boss had told him to go home hours ago, but David was known for his thoroughness. That dedication had earned him respect in his field, but right now, he wished he'd left earlier. Through his side mirror, David watched the police officer approach. Tall, middle-aged white man, moving with the confident stride of someone who'd been doing this job for many years. David took another deep breath and reminded himself of the rules he'd learned growing up. Be polite, don't argue, move slowly, and always keep your hands where they can be seen. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, probably his wife wondering where he was. He'd told her he'd be home by midnight. David knew better than to reach for it now. The night was eerily quiet on this suburban street. Most houses were dark, their occupants long asleep. Streetlights cast orange pools on the wet pavement, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. It was the kind of peaceful night that made David love this neighborhood, where he bought a house 5 years ago, hoping to find a safe place to eventually raise a family. As the officer got closer, David rehearsed what he would say. He wouldn't mention how tired he was or that he was just trying to get home. He wouldn't point out that he'd never had a speeding ticket before or that he knew most of the officers at the local precinct because of his job. Experience had taught him that offering too much information could sometimes make things worse. The weight of his credentials pressed against his chest from the inside pocket of his jacket. After 12 years in his position, David still felt a mix of pride and responsibility whenever he carried his badge. But he also knew that in these first moments of a traffic stop, he was just another driver to the approaching officer, and his appearance often shaped how these encounters began. David rolled down his window as the officer reached his car door. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and wet asphalt. The officer's flashlight beam swept across the car interior before settling partly on David's face, bright enough that he had to squint slightly. "Good evening, sir," David said, his voice calm and measured. He didn't add anything else, waiting for the officer to take the lead. The flashlight beam lowered slightly, no longer blinding him. In that moment, David couldn't know that this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. He couldn't know that the next few minutes would change something fundamental in how both men saw the world. All he knew was that right now, he needed to stay calm and follow the familiar script that had kept him safe all these years. Officer Wilson stood beside the black sedan, flashlight in hand, his shadow stretching long across the wet pavement. The beam of light swept across the interior of the car one more time. Everything looked in order, but years on the force had taught him to stay alert. Even routine stops could turn unpredictable. "License and registration, please," Wilson said, keeping his tone professional. He noticed how the driver maintained perfect eye contact, not challenging, but not intimidated either. Most people either avoided looking at him altogether or tried too hard to seem innocent. This man did neither. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my wallet in my inside jacket pocket, and then I'll get the registration from the glove compartment," David said clearly. Wilson nodded, appreciating the man's transparency. "Go ahead." The inside of the car smelled faintly of coffee and cologne. A dry cleaning receipt was tucked into a cup holder. A leather briefcase sat out on the back seat alongside a gym bag. Everything about the scene suggested a hard-working professional heading home after a long day. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Wilson asked, following the standard script. David's hands moved slowly as he reached for his wallet. "I'm guessing I was going a bit over the speed limit. I apologize for that. I've been working since 6 a.m., and I guess I was just eager to get home." Wilson studied the man's face. No slurred speech, no bloodshot eyes, just exhaustion etched around the edges of his expression. "I clocked you at 42 in a 30 zone, Wilson confirmed. "Where are you coming from at this hour?" "Downtown, Federal Building." Had reports to finish that couldn't wait till morning, David answered, handing over his license. Wilson took the ID and glanced at it. David Taylor. Address in the nice part of town, about 2 miles from here. Born 1980. Everything matched the man sitting before him. "And what kind of work do you do, Mr. Taylor?" Wilson asked. He didn't always make small talk during traffic stops, but something about this man made him curious. The night had grown quieter. Even the distant dog had stopped barking. The only sounds were the occasional car passing on the main road a block away and the soft hum of Wilson's patrol car behind them. "I work for the government," David replied simply. His hand moved toward the glove compartment. "I'm getting the registration now." Wilson noticed something shift in the atmosphere between them. Not tension exactly, but a kind of mutual assessment. He'd been a cop long enough to recognize when there was more to a story. Sometimes it meant trouble, but not always. As David opened the glove compartment, a stack of neatly organized papers sat inside. No fumbling, no nervous searching. He knew exactly where everything was. Wilson found himself wondering about this man's life. What was his story? Did he have a family waiting for him? Did he worry when police lights appeared in his mirror? These weren't questions Wilson usually asked himself during traffic stops. The training sessions from last month flashed through Wilson's mind. The instructor had talked about humanizing interactions and recognizing implicit biases. Wilson had sat in the back row, half listening. After 15 years, he'd figured he knew all he needed to know about dealing with the public. But standing here now, Wilson felt something uncomfortable stir within him. Would he have pulled over a middle-aged white man in a similar sedan for going 12 miles over the limit? Would he be asking the same questions? He liked to think the answer was yes, but he wasn't entirely sure. David handed over the registration with the same calm efficiency. Their fingers briefly touched during the exchange, a small human moment in the middle of this procedural interaction. "I'll be back in a moment," Wilson said, turning to walk back to his patrol car to run the standard checks. As he stepped away, Wilson didn't realize that the next few minutes would completely change the course of not just this traffic stop, but his understanding of his role as an officer. In his hand, he held David's license and registration, but in moments he would discover something else entirely, something that would make him question everything about this encounter and many others before it. Officer Wilson had just turned to head back to his patrol car when something caught his eye. A small leather wallet had fallen from David's jacket onto the car seat. It had opened slightly upon impact, and something metallic gleamed inside, reflecting the flashlight beam. "Sir, you dropped something," Wilson said, turning back. David looked down and saw the wallet. A flash of recognition crossed his face, followed by what almost looked like resignation. "Thank you, officer," he said quietly. Wilson waited as David picked up the fallen item. As he did, the leather folder opened more fully, revealing what was inside. The flashlight beam caught the unmistakable shine of a badge, not just any badge, but one Wilson recognized instantly. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Wilson's whole body went still. The routine traffic stop suddenly felt very different. He stared at the badge, then at David's face, making the connection. This wasn't just any government employee heading home after a long day. This was an FBI agent. "Agent Taylor," Wilson said, his tone changing involuntarily. The words came out part statement, part question. David nodded slightly, his expression unchanged. "Yes, officer. I wasn't trying to hide it. I just didn't think it was relevant to being pulled over for speeding." The night seemed to grow quieter around them. A car passed in the distance, its headlights briefly illuminating both men's faces before disappearing around a corner. In that flash of light, Wilson saw something in David's eyes, not arrogance or expectation of special treatment, but a patient wariness that spoke volumes. "May I?" Wilson asked, gesturing toward the badge. David handed it over without hesitation. The weight of it felt familiar in Wilson's palm, similar to his own but distinct in its design. He ran his thumb over the embossed letters and shield. Authentic without question. 12 years with the Bureau, David said, breaking the silence. Civil Rights Division. Those last 3 words hung in the air between them. Civil Rights Division. The department that, among other things, investigated police misconduct and bias-related incidents. The irony wasn't lost on Wilson. A drop of rain hit Wilson's cheek, then another. The earlier drizzle was returning, but neither man moved. The moment felt too important to interrupt. "I wasn't speeding because I'm FBI," David added. "I was speeding because I'm human and tired." A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, not mocking, but gently breaking the tension. Wilson handed the badge back, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. Such a simple human contact, yet somehow significant in this moment. "How long have you been with Atlanta PD?" David asked. 15 years next month, Wilson replied, surprised by the personal question. Most traffic stops didn't involve getting to know each other. David nodded thoughtfully. "Long enough to see a lot of changes." "Some," Wilson admitted, "not always enough." A car drove by slowly, its occupants glancing curiously at the police lights and the two men standing in the rain. Wilson became aware of how this might look to outsiders, a white officer and a black driver engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation at 1:30 in the morning. "Look," Wilson said, making a decision, "about the speeding." David raised his hand slightly. "I was over the limit. I don't expect special treatment." There was dignity in the statement that made Wilson pause. He pulled over off-duty officers before who had immediately flashed their badges, expecting to be let go with a nod and a wink. David had done the opposite. He hadn't mentioned his position until his badge fell out accidentally. The rain was coming down harder now, forming small puddles on the road surface. Both men were getting wet, but neither seemed to care. Something more important was happening here. A conversation that had started as a routine traffic stop was becoming something neither man had expected. "Agent Taylor," Wilson said finally, "I think we have a lot to talk about, but maybe not in the rain." The rain fell steadily now, droning on the roofs of both cars. Officer Wilson gestured toward his patrol vehicle. "We can sit in my car if you want to get out of this weather," he offered. David considered for a moment, then nodded. "Give me a second." He reached back into his car, grabbed his phone, and turned off the engine. A text from his wife lit up the screen. "Everything ok?" He quickly replied, "All good, tell you later," before pocketing the phone and following Wilson. The inside of the patrol car felt different from the driver's side. David had been in plenty of police vehicles during his career, but always as a fellow law enforcement officer, never as someone who'd been pulled over. The partition between the front and back seats, the radio quietly crackling with dispatcher voices, the laptop mounted to the dashboard, all created an atmosphere of authority that wasn't lost on him. "So, Civil Rights Division," Wilson said after they'd settled in. He turned down the radio volume and switched off the flashing lights, leaving just the soft glow from the dashboard illuminating their faces. "That must be challenging work." "It is," David replied, watching raindrops race down the windshield. "But important. Especially these days." A comfortable silence fell between them. Two men from different worlds, yet connected by the shared experience of wearing a badge. Each understood the weight of responsibility that came with it, even if they carried that weight differently. "Can I ask you something?" Wilson said finally. "And I'm not trying to be difficult here. I genuinely want to know." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I pulled you over tonight, what went through your mind?" David turned slightly in his seat to face Wilson more directly. The question was simple but loaded with meaning. He could give the easy answer or the honest one. "First, I thought about my hands," David said, making sure they stayed visible. "Then I thought about my tone of voice, keeping it respectful but not fearful. Then I thought about my movement, slow, deliberate, nothing sudden." He took a breath. "These aren't things I learned at Quantico. These are things my father taught me when I was 16. Wilson nodded slowly, absorbing the words. The rain seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. "I've been pulled over 23 times in my life," David continued. Only 7 resulted in tickets. Most were for things like a broken taillight that wasn't actually broken, or allegedly rolling through a stop sign, or, my personal favorite, looking suspicious. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a statement of facts. Wilson looked down at his hands on the steering wheel. "Before I saw your badge, I was already planning to let you go with a warning. You weren't driving recklessly, just a little fast." "I appreciate that," David said, "but we both know that's not always how these stories end." A police call came through the radio. A disturbance at a gas station across town. Not Wilson's sector. Someone else responded. "You know what the hardest part of my job is?" David asked, watching the wipers push rain across the glass. "It's believing in the system while trying to fix it at the same time. Wearing the badge with pride while acknowledging its complicated history." Wilson had never thought about it that way before. His badge had always been a source of straightforward pride, a symbol of his commitment to protect and serve. The idea that it could represent something more complex hadn't really occurred to him. "I've been a cop for 15 years, Wilson said. "I've always tried to do right by people, treat everyone the same." "I believe you," David said, and somehow those 3 simple words carried more weight than a lengthy speech could have. But same and equal aren't always the same thing. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating both their faces. In that flash of light, each man saw the other clearly, not just physically, but something deeper: recognition, understanding, the beginnings of respect that transcended their different uniforms and experiences. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter against the roof of the patrol car. Officer Wilson shifted in his seat, turning slightly to face David more directly. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had somehow transformed into one of the most honest conversations he'd had in years. "You know, we had that training last month," Wilson said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "About bias and community relations. Most of the guys treated it like a joke, something to get through." "And you?" David asked. Wilson tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, thinking. "I didn't treat it like a joke, but I probably didn't take it as seriously as I should have. I kept thinking, I'm not the problem. I treat everyone the same." Outside, a few cars drove past, their headlights briefly illuminating the interior of the patrol car before fading away. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:17 a.m. Both men had places to be, but neither seemed in a hurry to end this unexpected moment. "Can I tell you something that might sound strange?" David asked. Wilson nodded, and he continued. "Sometimes I pull out my FBI badge before I reach for my wallet when I get pulled over. And other times, like tonight, I don't. It's almost like I'm testing something, watching how differently I'm treated before and after." Wilson felt a twinge of discomfort at the words. "And what have you found?" "That a badge changes everything," David replied simply. "Suddenly I go from being a potential threat to being a brother in blue. Same person, same actions, different perception." The words hum in the air between them. Wilson wanted to disagree, to defend his profession and himself, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the lack of accusation in David's tone. He wasn't attacking, just sharing his reality. "I have a 12-year-old son," David said, looking out at the rain-slicked street. "Last year, I had to have the talk with him, not about girls or growing up, about how to survive a police encounter." Wilson had heard about these conversations, black parents teaching their children what to do if stopped by police. It had always seemed distant to him, something that happened in other communities, other cities. "What did you tell him?" Wilson asked quietly. "To be polite, to move slowly, to keep his hands visible at all times, to say yes sir and no sir, to not argue even if he knows he's right." David paused. "Do you know how hard that is? To tell your child that standing up for himself might get him hurt, that his safety might depend on being smaller than he is." Wilson tried to imagine having that conversation with his own daughter. The thought made something twist inside him. "The hardest part," David continued, "was seeing the confusion in his eyes. He knows I'm FBI. He's seen my badge, held it, been proud of it. So he asked me, 'Dad, why would they hurt me if I'm not doing anything wrong?' And I didn't have a good answer." A call came through on the radio, a noise complaint across town. Someone else responded, and the car fell silent again. "I don't want to be part of that problem," Wilson said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought I was." "Most officers don't," David replied. "That's what makes this so complicated. Good people can still be part of broken systems." Wilson looked down at his badge, seeing it differently than he had hours earlier. "So what do we do? How do we fix it?" "We're doing it right now," David said, a small smile forming. "Talking, listening, seeing each other as humans first, not just uniforms or skin colors." He gestured between them. "This is where it starts." Wilson nodded slowly, feeling something shift inside him. He'd entered this night thinking he knew everything about being a good police officer. Now he realized he still had so much to learn. "You know what's funny?" Wilson said. "I pulled you over to teach you a lesson about speeding. Instead, you're teaching me something a lot more important. 3 weeks later, Officer Wilson stood at the back of the police academy's main lecture hall, watching as David adjusted the microphone at the podium. The room was filled with about 40 police cadets in their crisp uniforms, along with a dozen veteran officers who had been strongly encouraged to attend by the chief. The rain that had fallen on the night of their first meeting had given way to the warm sunshine of early spring. Outside the windows, trees were beginning to bloom, a reminder that change was a natural part of life. "I want to thank Officer James Wilson for inviting me here today," David began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "What started as a simple traffic stop has turned into something neither of us expected." Wilson smiled slightly, remembering that night. He had ultimately given David a warning for speeding, but they had exchanged phone numbers before parting ways. Something told him their conversation wasn't finished. In the days that followed, Wilson had found himself thinking differently during his patrols. He noticed his own snap judgments more clearly, which cars he chose to follow, which people made him instinctively suspicious. Sometimes he would catch himself and wonder, am I seeing a problem, or am I seeing a person who looks like my idea of a problem? Law enforcement is one of the hardest jobs in the world, David was saying to the cadets. You make split-second decisions that can change lives forever. You see people at their worst moments. You carry the weight of keeping communities safe. The cadets nodded, many of them looking proud. This was what they had signed up for. "But today I want to talk about something else," David continued. "I want to talk about what it feels like to be seen as a threat before you're seen as a person." Wilson watched as the room shifted slightly. Some officers crossed their arms defensively. Others leaned forward, interested. The chief, standing at the back wall, gave Wilson an approving nod. It hadn't been easy to arrange this talk. Some of Wilson's fellow officers had questioned why he was stirring up trouble. A few had stopped inviting him for beers after shift. But the chief had surprised him by being immediately supportive. "It's about time we had these conversations," she had said. As David shared stories from his dual perspective as both a black man and a federal agent, Wilson noticed the cadets' expressions changing. This wasn't the confrontational anti-police rhetoric some might have feared. It was something more powerful, honest experiences shared with respect and a genuine desire to make things better. After the formal talk ended, David and Wilson walked together through the academy parking lot. "That went better than I expected," David admitted, loosening his tie in the afternoon heat. "They listened. That's a start," Wilson replied. "My sergeant actually asked if you could come back next month for the Veteran Officers Training Day." David grinned. "I might be able to make that work." They reached David's car, the same black sedan from that rainy night, now sparkling clean in the sunlight. "You know," Wilson said, "my daughter asked me the other day why I became a cop. It's been so long I had to really think about it." "And?" David prompted. "I told her it was to help people, to make a difference." Wilson shook his head. "Somewhere along the way, I think I forgot that people means everybody, not just the ones who look like me or think like me." David nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's never too late to remember. As they shook hands in the parking lot, both men knew that what had begun as a chance encounter had grown into something that would ripple outward, through the police department, through their families, through their communities. The next day, Wilson started his shift with something new in his patrol car, a small notebook where he began tracking his own traffic stops, looking for patterns in his own behavior. It was a small step, but real change always started small. What he didn't know yet was that across town, David was sitting in his FBI office, drafting a new training program inspired by their conversation, one that would eventually be adopted by departments across the state. One traffic stop, two perspectives, 1,000 possibilities for change.